Picture this, a war that raged for over a century, a conflict so vast it redrew the map of Europe, pitting kings against kings, nations against nations. But here's the twist. Some of the most decisive moments of the 100 Years' War didn't come from the clash of swords or the roar of cannons. They came from the unthinkable, bitter enemies shaking hands, former rivals standing shoulder to shoulder, alliances so improbable they sound like something out of a legend. This wasn't just a war of armies, it was a war of surprises, where the tides of battle could turn in an instant because of a single, unexpected partnership. Think about the sheer audacity of it. Nobles betraying their own kings to side with foreign rulers, mercenaries known for their loyalty to gold alone, suddenly fighting for a cause they once scorned. Even entire cities, caught between two warring powers, choosing to align with the side they'd spent decades resisting. These weren't just fleeting truces or temporary ceasefires. They were game-changing alliances that rewrote the rules of the conflict. And the most fascinating part, many of these partnerships were born not out of friendship, but out of sheer desperation, clever strategy, or sometimes pure opportunism. So how did these unlikely alliances come to be? What drove sworn enemies to set aside their grudges, even for a moment, and join forces? And perhaps most importantly, why did these fleeting partnerships end up shaping the outcome of one of history's longest and bloodiest wars? That's exactly what we're about to explore. From shadowy backroom deals to battlefield betrayals that changed the course of nations, we're diving into 25 of the most astonishing alliances of the 100 Years' War, uncovering the stories behind the handshakes that history almost forgot. Strap in, because this isn't just a tale of war. It's a tale of the unpredictable, the improbable, and the alliances that defied all odds. The 100 Years' War was never just a simple showdown between England and France. Imagine a chessboard where half the pieces keep switching colors mid-game. That's how chaotic the political landscape was. For over a century, from 1337 to 1453, this wasn't just a war of armies clashing on fields like Crecy or Agincourt. It was a war of whispers in shadowed halls, of nobles weighing survival against loyalty, and of kingdoms teetering on the edge of collapse. France, fractured by rival duchies and crumbling royal authority, became a battleground not just for invaders but for its own fractured nobility. Meanwhile, England's kings, from Edward III to Henry V, weren't just foreign enemies, they were claimants to the French throne itself, weaving their ambitions into the very fabric of the conflict. But here's what made this war truly unpredictable. No one could afford to fight alone. A French lord might swear allegiance to Paris one day, only to secretly court English gold the next. Mercenary companies like the infamous Free Companies played both sides, selling their swords to the highest bidder. Even entire cities like Burgundy flipped allegiances in shocking betrayals that reshaped the war overnight. This wasn't just about battles, it was about survival in a world where today's ally could be tomorrow's executioner. And that desperation, that knife's-edge calculus of loyalty, is what birthed the most improbable alliances of the era. To understand why these partnerships mattered, picture France not as a unified kingdom, but as a patchwork of fiefdoms, each with its own armies, grudges, and agendas. The Valois kings struggled to control their own nobles, let alone repel the English. Meanwhile, England's successes often hinged on exploiting those very fractures. When an English army marched, it wasn't just facing French resistance, it was navigating a labyrinth of potential allies and traitors. That's why a single handshake between enemies could tilt the war. A defecting duke might open the gates of a fortress. A mercenary captain's betrayal could strand an army without supplies. These weren't minor twists, they were seismic shifts that decided kingdoms. So as we explore these 25 unlikely alliances, remember, each one wasn't just a diplomatic footnote. It was a lifeline thrown in desperation, a gambit played in the shadows, or a betrayal that echoed across centuries. This was a war where the rules of loyalty were rewritten daily, and where the most unexpected partnerships often held the sharpest blades. The Burgundians turning against France wasn't just a betrayal, it was a seismic crack in the very foundation of the war. Picture this: the Duke of Burgundy, one of the wealthiest and most influential nobles in Europe, watching as his father, John the Fearless, was brutally murdered on a bridge in Montereau in 1419. The killer, supporters of the French crown prince, the future Charles VII. That moment didn't just ignite a personal vendetta. It lit the fuse for one of the most shocking political reversals in medieval history. Burgundy's alliance with England wasn't born out of shared ideals or mutual respect. It was pure, calculated revenge. Duke Philip the Good, now ruling Burgundy, saw an opportunity to cripple the French monarchy that had failed to punish his father's killers. And who better to help him than Henry V of England, a king whose military genius was matched only by his ambition? Together, they struck a deal that would alter the course of the war. Burgundy's support gave Henry something priceless: legitimacy. Suddenly, the English weren't just foreign invaders, they were allies of France's own nobility. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 was the crowning blow. With Burgundy's backing, Henry forced the French to recognize him as heir to the throne, disinheriting Charles VII. It was a masterstroke. On paper, England had won. Henry married Catherine of Valois, daughter of the French king, and for a brief, dizzying moment, it seemed the war might end with an English king ruling both nations. But alliances built on vengeance rarely last. Burgundy's power came at a price. The deeper they tied themselves to England, the more they alienated other French nobles. The same dukes who had once resented the Valois monarchy now saw Burgundy as the greater threat. What's often forgotten is how fragile this alliance truly was. Burgundy didn't want an English victory. They wanted a weakened France, one they could dominate. Henry's sudden death in 1422 left a child on the throne, and Burgundy began to waver. The tide turned again when Joan of Arc rallied the French, and by 1435, even the Burgundians had to admit their gamble had failed. Their betrayal had bought England temporary dominance, but in the long run, it united France against a common enemy. The Burgundian Alliance was a masterpiece of political theater, one that proved even the most powerful partnerships could crumble when built on shifting sands. While England and France dominated the headlines of the 100 Years' War, there was another player lurking in the shadows: Scotland. The so-called Auld Alliance between Scotland and France wasn't just a diplomatic formality. It was a centuries-old bond forged in blood and necessity, a pact that would turn Scottish warriors into France's secret weapon against their common English foe. Imagine the scene: England's armies surging across the Channel, hammering the French at battles like Agincourt, while back home, Scottish forces kept launching devastating raids across the northern border. For the English, it was a nightmare scenario, fighting a two-front war with enemies who refused to play by the rules. The Scots didn't just send token support, they sent their best. Take Archibald Douglas, the fearless Earl of Wigtown, leading thousands of Scottish troops straight into the heart of France. These weren't mercenaries fighting for pay. They were men who saw the English as their ancestral enemy, and they fought with a ferocity that stunned even battle-hardened French commanders. But the most legendary moment came when the Scots crossed paths with Joan of Arc. At the Siege of Orleans in 1429, Scottish troops stood shoulder to shoulder with the Maid of Orleans, their longbows and spears helping turn the tide. The English, who had grown used to French hesitation, suddenly faced an enemy that fought with the same relentless aggression they did. The Scots didn't just bring soldiers, they brought a psychological edge. Their presence on the battlefield sent a clear message. England couldn't crush France without also facing the wrath of its northern neighbors. Yet the Auld Alliance was more than just a military pact. It was economic warfare, too. Scottish privateers prowled the English Channel, choking off supply lines and sinking ships loaded with reinforcements. French wine flowed into Scottish ports, while Scottish wool kept French looms running. Every barrel traded, every ship seized, was another twist of the knife in England's side. The real brilliance of this alliance, it forced England into an impossible choice: pour more troops into France and risk leaving the Scottish border undefended. Focus on Scotland and the French would regroup. For decades, the Auld Alliance kept England off balance, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon in war isn't a sword, it's a well-timed distraction. And in the end, that distraction may have been just what France needed to survive. Sometimes the most dangerous weapon in a war isn't a blade or a cannon. It's a fleet of ships crewed by men who fight not for king or country, but for gold. That's exactly what France learned the hard way when the Castilian mercenaries, led by the formidable Enrique of Trastamara, abandoned their French paymasters and threw their lot in with Edward, the Black Prince of England. This wasn't just a minor shift in manpower, it was a game-changer that would cripple French naval dominance for years to come. The Castilians weren't ordinary sellswords. These were seasoned fighters, hardened by years of conflict on both land and sea, and their defection came at the worst possible moment for France. Enrique, a master tactician with a personal grudge against the French crown, saw an opportunity to strike back, and the Black Prince, ever the opportunist, welcomed him with open arms. The prize, control of the English Channel, the lifeline that kept England's armies supplied and France's coasts vulnerable. The turning point came at the Battle of La Rochelle in 1372. The French fleet, confident in their superiority, faced a devastating surprise. The Castilians didn't just fight for England, they fought like demons. Their galleys, lighter and faster than the bulky French ships, sliced through the waves with terrifying precision. The Castilian crossbowmen rained death from above while their marines boarded enemy vessels with brutal efficiency. By the time the smoke cleared, the French navy lay in ruins, their ships either sunk or captured. Overnight, England ruled the waves, and France's ability to resupply or reinforce its coastal strongholds evaporated. What makes this alliance so fascinating isn't just its immediate impact, it's the sheer unpredictability of it. Mercenaries were supposed to be fickle, switching sides at the drop of a coin. But the Castilians didn't just switch, they became the backbone of England's naval strategy. Their knowledge of Atlantic currents, their mastery of ship-to-ship combat, even their ruthless tactics, all of it gave the English an edge France couldn't match. And for Enrique, it was more than just a paycheck. Aligning with the Black Prince was a calculated move to weaken the French, who had backed his rivals in Castile's own civil wars. Yet, like so many alliances in this war, it wasn't built to last. The Black Prince's failing health and England's shifting priorities eventually left the Castilians sidelined. But the damage was done. La Rochelle proved that in the 100 Years' War, loyalty was negotiable, and the right mercenaries, with the right grudges, could rewrite history in a single battle. Gascony was supposed to be French territory, in theory, but loyalty in the Middle Ages was never that simple. Imagine a region where the local lords spoke Occitan more often than French, where vineyards shipped their wine to London instead of Paris, and where generations of intermarriage had tied noble families more closely to English dukes than to their own king. This was Gascony, a land caught between two worlds, and when the 100 Years' War erupted, its lords faced an impossible choice: side with the distant French crown they barely knew, or double down on their century-old bonds with England. For many Gascon nobles, the decision was shockingly easy. Men like Jean de Grailly, the Captal de Butch, didn't just quietly support England, they became some of its most ferocious champions. Why? Because England offered something France couldn't: autonomy. The English kings were happy to let Gascon lords rule their lands as they saw fit, so long as taxes flowed and troops mustered when called. France, on the other hand, demanded obedience, a word that sat poorly with men who'd spent generations acting like kings in their own castles. The Gascons didn't just bring soldiers to England's cause, they brought something far more valuable: local knowledge. While French armies stumbled through unfamiliar terrain, Gascon guides led English troops through hidden mountain passes and river fords. Gascon wine merchants turned their trade networks into spy rings, passing intelligence to English commanders. Even the region's geography worked in England's favor. Bordeaux, Gascony's greatest port, became a lifeline, funneling men, money, and supplies across the Channel. Without Gascon support, England's early victories, like the crushing triumph at Poitiers in 1356, might have been impossible. But let's be clear, this wasn't pure loyalty. The Gascon lords were masters of realpolitik. When the Black Prince ravaged the French countryside, Gascon raiders often joined in, not out of patriotism, but because pillaging rich French lands was better business than tending vineyards. And when the tides of war shifted, so did Gascon allegiances. The same families that once toasted English kings would later bend the knee to France when it suited them, like the Count of Armagnac, who flipped sides so often he became a punchline in diplomatic circles. Yet in those early decades, Gascony's choice to stand with England reshaped the war. It gave the English a foothold on the continent that France couldn't easily dislodge, and it proved something crucial. In the chaos of medieval warfare, local ties could matter more than national identity. The Gascons weren't just mercenaries or turncoats, they were survivors, playing both sides against the middle to protect their own power. And for a time, their gamble made England unstoppable. The Kingdom of Navarre was a mouse dancing between lions, a tiny sliver of land wedged between the giants of France and Castile, surviving not through strength but through sheer cunning. And no one played this dangerous game better than Charles II, the man history would remember as the Bad. His nickname wasn't just for show. This was a ruler who elevated betrayal to an art form, weaving webs of conspiracy so intricate that even his allies never knew when they might become pawns in his next scheme. Charles didn't just want survival, he wanted power, and in the chaos of the 100 Years' War, he saw his chance. Officially, Navarre was a French vassal, but Charles had no intention of bowing to Paris. Instead, he secretly reached out to England's Edward III, offering a deal: Navarre's support in exchange for lands, titles, and a free hand to undermine the French crown. It was a bold gamble, but Charles had an ace up his sleeve: his bloodline. As a descendant of French kings himself, he could claim the throne if France faltered. Suddenly, this minor king became a thorn in France's side, a shadow player pulling strings across the continent. The beauty of Charles's strategy was its flexibility. When the French grew suspicious, he'd stage elaborate displays of loyalty, only to funnel English gold to rebellious French nobles behind the scenes. When Edward III hesitated, Charles played the victim, painting himself as a misunderstood ruler crushed between greater powers. and when outright war seemed too risky, he turned to piracy, hiring Navarre's privateers to raid French shipping lanes while pleading ignorance to his out-of-control subjects. Every move was calculated, every betrayal deniable, but Charles's masterpiece came in 1356 when he orchestrated the assassination of Charles of Spain, the French king's trusted constable. The murder sent shockwaves through France, destabilizing the monarchy just as England's Black Prince launched his devastating campaign. For years, Navarre's king had been the ghost haunting French strategy, always just out of reach, always one step ahead. His alliance with England proved that in this war, territory mattered less than chaos. A single ruthless mind, willing to exploit every crack in the system, could do more damage than an entire army. Yet in the end, Charles's greatest weakness was his own ambition. His constant double-dealing left him with no true allies, only temporary accomplices. When the English grew weary of his schemes and the French finally cornered him, even his silver tongue couldn't talk his way out. But his legacy lived on, proof that in the 100 Years' War, the smallest kingdoms could cast the longest shadows. The Flemish cities weren't just trading hubs, they were powder kegs waiting to explode. For decades, the Counts of Flanders had ruled these bustling merchant republics in name, but in reality, the real power lay with the guilds, the weavers, and the men who controlled the flow of wool and cloth across Europe. And when France tried to tighten its grip on these wealthy cities, it ignited a rebellion that would drag England into the heart of the conflict. Here's what made Flanders so valuable: its economy ran on English wool. The finest fleeces from Cotswold sheep were shipped across the Channel to Flemish looms, where artisans turned them into luxury textiles sold from Paris to Constantinople. But French kings, eager to assert control, imposed crushing taxes and trade restrictions, strangling the lifeblood of cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres. The merchants had a choice: starve under French rule or throw their lot in with England's Edward III, who promised open trade and lowered tariffs. For the Flemish, this wasn't just politics, it was survival. The rebellion began with Jacob van Artevelde, a wealthy brewer from Ghent who became the unlikely face of Flemish resistance. He didn't just negotiate with England, he openly declared Edward III the rightful king of France, a direct challenge to French authority. In return, Edward flooded Flanders with cheap wool, reviving the textile trade overnight. But Artevelde's real masterstroke was turning Flemish militias into a fighting force. These weren't peasants with pitchforks. They were disciplined urban troops, veterans of guild wars, and they quickly became England's most reliable allies on the continent. The French response was brutal. They cut off grain shipments, blockaded ports, and even persuaded the Count of Flanders to arrest Artevelde's supporters. But the more pressure Paris applied, the more defiant the cities became. In 1340, Artevelde's militia crushed a French-backed army at the Battle of Bruges, proving that merchant armies could outfight feudal knights. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed Flanders might become England's gateway to dominating Europe, until Artevelde's own people turned on him. The same mobs that had cheered his defiance accused him of hoarding power, and in a grim twist, he was torn apart by the very crowds he'd once led. Yet the alliance didn't die with him. Even after Artevelde's fall, Flemish cities continued to resist French control, tying down thousands of French troops that might have been sent against England. Their rebellion proved something revolutionary. In an age of kings and knights, money could be mightier than swords. The Flemish didn't fight for crowns or glory. They fought for their looms, their markets, and their right to choose their own allies. And in doing so, they showed Europe that the rules of war were changing. The age of merchants had begun. Brittany was supposed to be French soil, but like so much in the 100 Years' War, the reality was far messier. The duchy had long danced between independence and vassalage, its rulers swearing just enough loyalty to Paris to keep the peace while ruling like sovereign kings in their own lands. Then in 1341, Duke John III died without a clear heir, and suddenly, Brittany wasn't just a territory, it was the prize in a vicious tug of war between two rival claimants, each backed by a different European superpower. On one side stood Charles of Blois, nephew to the French king, draped in Valois approval. On the other, John of Montfort, a brash noble who saw England's Edward III as his ticket to power. What followed wasn't just a local squabble, it was a 23-year civil war that turned Brittany into a blood-soaked chessboard where England and France fought by proxy. Montfort's play for English support was pure desperation. Outgunned and outmaneuvered by Charles's French-backed forces, he fled to England in 1342, throwing himself at Edward's feet. The English king, always eager to find new ways to pressure France, saw the opportunity immediately. Brittany's ports were perfect staging grounds for invasions, its nobles restless under French influence. By backing Montfort, Edward could plant a dagger pointed straight at France's western flank. The deal was struck, English troops and gold for Montfort's claim. But Charles of Blois wasn't about to surrender. With French knights and mercenaries flooding into Brittany, the conflict became a war of grueling sieges and sudden betrayals. Castles changed hands overnight, their lords swapping allegiances based on who'd last paid them. The most infamous moment came at the Battle of the 30 in 1351, a chivalric spectacle where 30 champions from each side fought to the death in a field near Ploermel. The English-backed Breton faction won, but the real lesson was clear. This war would be fought with medieval pageantry masking sheer brutality. What turned the tide wasn't just force, it was perseverance. Montfort's widow, Joanna of Flanders, became the unlikely spine of the resistance after her husband's capture. Dubbed Jeanne la Flamme for her fiery defense of Hennebont Castle, she led sorties against French besiegers, rallying troops with a mix of charisma and sheer audacity. Her tenacity kept the Montfort cause alive long enough for England to send reinforcements, including a young knight named John Chandos, whose tactical genius would later shape the war's greatest battles. The final twist, neither claimant lived to see the war's end. Charles died in battle in 1364. Montfort succumbed to illness years earlier. It was Montfort's son, another John, who emerged victorious, but only after decades of carnage that left Brittany exhausted. The English, though, got exactly what they wanted. A friendly Brittany meant safe harbors for their ships, a buffer against French attacks, and a constant headache for Paris. This proxy war proved something crucial. In the 100 Years' War, sometimes the most strategic victories came not on open battlefields, but in the shadowy realm of succession disputes and dynastic gambles. And Brittany's tragedy became England's triumph. High in the snow-capped Alps, where icy winds howled through narrow mountain passes, the Savoyards watched the 100 Years' War unfold from what should have been the sidelines. Technically, the County of Savoy owed allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor, not the King of France but Amadeus VI, the so-called Green Count for his signature emerald livery, wasn't about to let formalities dictate his strategy. What he saw was an empire distracted and a France in crisis, and where others saw danger, he saw pure opportunity. Savoy's value wasn't in its armies or its wealth, but in something far more precious: geography. Nestled between France, Italy, and the Empire, its mountain passes were the choke points of medieval Europe. Control them, and you controlled the flow of troops, supplies, and gold between warring nations. Amadeus understood this better than anyone, so when the French, reeling from English victories, came knocking, he didn't just offer sympathy, he offered access. For the right price, Savoy's Alpine gates would swing open for French reinforcements while slamming shut on England's German and Italian mercenaries. The genius of this alliance lay in its subtlety. Savoy never formally declared war on England. Instead, Amadeus played the role of the neutral mediator, hosting peace conferences while quietly funneling French troops through the Mont-Cenis Pass. His knights, famed for their endurance in mountain warfare, harassed English supply lines under the guise of keeping order. Even Savoy's castles, perched on sheer cliffs, became unsinkable fortresses where French garrisons could regroup safely, far from the English longbows that had devastated them on open ground. But the Green Count's masterstroke came in 1365, when he brokered a marriage between his cousin and the Duke of Anjou, a powerful French royal. Suddenly, Savoy wasn't just a hired hand, it was family. French gold flowed into Savoy's coffers, funding roads and bridges that made troop movements even faster. In return, Savoy's influence stretched into Provence and Dauphiné, turning the southeastern flank of France into an impenetrable shield. The irony: this alliance saved France precisely because it wasn't built on blind loyalty. Amadeus demanded concessions, lands, titles, trading rights every time he extended his help. His support had strings attached, and those strings became ropes that pulled Savoy from a minor Alpine county to a rising European power. By the time the English realized how thoroughly Savoy had tipped the scales, it was too late. The mountains had spoken, and in the 100 Years' War, geography could be a deadlier weapon than any sword. The Genoese crossbowmen didn't just fight for France, they terrified for them. Picture a battlefield where most armies relied on hastily trained peasant levies, and then imagine facing a corps of professional killers, each one drilled to perfection, their steel-tipped bolts capable of punching through armor at 200 paces. These weren't just mercenaries, they were the medieval equivalent of special forces, and when France's King Philip VI opened his treasury to hire them, he wasn't just buying soldiers, he was purchasing a reputation. The Genoese came with a pedigree of violence. For decades, their crossbow guilds had dominated Mediterranean warfare, their skills honed in the brutal factional wars of Italy's city-states. Unlike the French knights who saw battle as a chivalric sport, the Genoese treated it like a trade. They didn't care about glory or honor, they cared about efficiency. And in the early years of the 100 Years' War, that efficiency was France's secret weapon. At the Battle of Sluys in 1340, their disciplined volleys shattered English boarding parties, turning the decks of French ships into killing zones. At St. Omer, their relentless barrage broke Flemish rebel charges before they could reach French lines. For a time, it seemed no army could stand against them. Then came Crecy in 1346, the disaster that would overshadow everything. The Genoese, exhausted from a forced march and hampered by rain-soaked strings, found themselves outranged by English longbows. Their famed discipline crumbled under the storm of arrows, and when they retreated, the furious French knights rode them down, accusing them of cowardice. It became one of the war's most infamous moments, a cautionary tale about the perils of mercenary loyalty. But here's what often gets forgotten: the Genoese didn't vanish after Crecy. They adapted. Later in the war, their commanders learned to deploy in staggered formations, using pavai shields to weather arrow storms while reloading. At Poitiers a decade later, their revised tactics allowed them to pin down English flanks, buying time for French counterattacks. Their story isn't just one of failure, it's a lesson in the evolution of warfare. France's reliance on them revealed a harsh truth. In an age of rising professional armies, even the mightiest kingdom couldn't win without outside expertise. And for the Genoese, war wasn't personal, it was business. Whether they fought for France today or Burgundy tomorrow mattered less than the weight of the gold in their purses. That's the real legacy of this alliance. It proved that in the 100 Years' War, loyalty was negotiable, but skill was priceless. The Genoese didn't change sides, they changed battlefields, leaving their mark wherever the pay was right and the odds were survivable. And in doing so, they helped redefine what it meant to be a soldier. Wales had been subjugated by England, but the conquest left deep scars, a land bristling with resentment, its people longing for independence. Yet in a twist of fate, the very warriors who once fought against English rule would become their conquerors' most lethal asset. The Welsh Longbowmen didn't just join England's armies, they revolutionized medieval warfare, turning the tide of battles with their unmatched skill and staggering firepower. Their bows weren't just weapons, they were instruments of terror, crafted from yew and standing as tall as a man. These longbows could launch arrows capable of piercing plate armor at 300 paces. What made the Welsh archers truly formidable wasn't just their equipment, though it was their upbringing. From childhood, they trained relentlessly, developing the muscle and precision needed to loose a dozen arrows a minute with deadly accuracy. When they took the field, their volleys darkened the sky like a storm of steel, shredding enemy formations before the first knight could lower his lance. But why would these men, whose fathers and grandfathers had fought English occupation, now fight for the crown that had crushed their homeland? The answer lay in pragmatism. Edward I's brutal conquest had left Wales impoverished, and the English offered something irresistible: steady pay and land. A skilled archer could earn more in a month of campaigning than a farmer might see in a year. Better yet, veterans were often granted parcels of land in occupied territories, transforming landless Welshmen into minor landowners overnight. It was a shrewd bargain loyalty in exchange for social mobility. The partnership reached its zenith at Agincourt in 1415. Outnumbered and exhausted, Henry V's army faced annihilation by a French force 3 times its size. But as the French knights advanced through the mud, the Welsh archers unleashed a hailstorm of arrows so dense it sounded like a great wind. Horses collapsed, armor buckled, and the charge dissolved into chaos. By the battle's end, the flower of French nobility lay dead, and the Welsh, once reviled as rebels, were hailed as heroes. Yet this alliance was never without tension. Welsh archers often served under their own captains, preserving a sense of identity even in English ranks. Songs and battle cries in their native tongue echoed across battlefields, a reminder that their loyalty was earned, not inherited. And when the war ended, many returned home not as conquerors, but as men who'd traded their bows for a chance at a better life. Their legacy, though, was indelible. In the story of the 100 Years' War, the Welsh longbow stands as a testament to an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the most powerful alliances are born not from love, but from necessity. Aragon's involvement in the 100 Years' War was a masterclass in playing the long game. While the kingdom's borders lay far from the battlefields of Normandy and Gascony, its rulers understood that France's struggle against England wasn't just a distant conflict, it was a chance to reshape the balance of power across the entire Iberian Peninsula. For King Peter IV of Aragon, supporting France wasn't about chivalry or shared ideals. It was cold, calculated strategy. His real adversary, Castile, Aragon's rival to the west, whose growing influence threatened to tip the scales of Iberian politics. Peter saw a weakened France as a disaster waiting to happen. If England triumphed, Castile, already allied with the English through trade and marriage, would gain even more leverage. So Aragon's king made his move quietly, offering France not armies, but something just as vital: gold. Massive loans flowed from Barcelona's coffers to Paris, keeping French armies in the field when their treasury ran dry. Aragonese bankers became the invisible lifeline of the Valois monarchy, their coins funding everything from mercenary contracts to siege engines, but the real brilliance lay in the diplomacy. Peter's envoys worked tirelessly to isolate Castile, persuading smaller Iberian kingdoms and Italian states to withhold support from England's allies. The most audacious play came in 1380, when Aragon brokered a secret pact with France's Charles VI. In exchange for continued financial backing, Aragon gained trading rights in southern French ports and a promise that France would never support Castile in border disputes. It was a deal struck in shadows, with no grand battles or heroic speeches, just parchment, seals, and the quiet shifting of allegiances. Yet Aragon's support wasn't unconditional. When the French suffered devastating defeats, Peter hedged his bets, briefly flirting with England to keep his options open. This wasn't betrayal, it was survival. In the end, though, Aragon's money and diplomacy bought France something priceless: time. While English victories piled up, French commanders could regroup, rebuild, and wait for the tide to turn. All because a kingdom hundreds of miles away decided that its enemy's enemy was worth a chest of gold and a well-timed whisper at the right court. The lesson: in the 100 Years' War, the most powerful alliances weren't always the loudest. Sometimes the flick of a banker's pen or a king's discreet nod could shape the fate of nations just as decisively as any sword stroke. The free companies didn't fight for crowns or causes, they fought for coin. These were the outlaws, the unemployed, the men left behind when the wars of kings left whole regions in ruins. Imagine bands of hardened veterans, their armor patched, their weapons notched from a dozen battles, roaming the countryside like wolves. They had no borders, no allegiances, only a simple rule: the highest bidder got their blades. One day they might be burning French villages for English gold. The next, they could be turning on their former paymasters if the purse was heavier on the other side. What made them so dangerous wasn't just their skill, it was their sheer unpredictability. Kings could negotiate with rival monarchs, but how do you reason with a man who answers only to his own greed? The free companies operated like a shadow economy of violence. When the Black Prince marched through France, they swarmed in his wake, looting towns he couldn't afford to sack openly. When the French crown ran short on troops, these same mercenaries would suddenly appear on their payroll, only to vanish again the moment payments dried up. Their loyalty lasted exactly as long as the silver kept flowing. The most infamous of these bands, the Grand Company, didn't just raid, they conquered. In 1362, they seized the entire Provence region, holding it hostage until the Pope himself paid them off to leave. Another band, the Tarred Venus, became so powerful they threatened to sack Avignon, the heart of Christendom, unless given a king's ransom. These weren't petty bandits, they were warlords in all but name, turning the chaos of the war into their personal empire. Yet for all their ruthlessness, the free companies exposed a harsh truth. In the 100 Years' War, even the mightiest kings needed them. When the French needed to garrison a fortress but couldn't spare their own troops, mercenaries filled the gap. When England's campaign stretched too thin, these roving bands became their de facto reinforcements. The irony: the very men who destabilized the war also kept it going. Without them, neither side could have sustained the conflict for decades. Their legacy is a paradox. They were both the symptom of the war's devastation and the engine that prolonged it. And in the end, their greatest victory wasn't on any battlefield. It was proving that in a world where kingdoms rose and fell, gold was the only flag they'd ever salute. The Papacy walked a diplomatic tightrope during the 100 Years' War, officially the peacemaker, quietly the partisan. Rome's allegiance to France ran deeper than politics. It was rooted in centuries of tradition. Since the days of Charlemagne, French kings had positioned themselves as the Church's protectors, and in return, the papacy often viewed England's ambitions with suspicion. But when battlefields from Normandy to Gascony ran red, even the popes couldn't ignore their duty to Christendom. Their interventions became a paradox, attempts to broker peace that somehow always left France with the better terms. Take Pope Clement VI's mediation in the 1340s. Fresh off England's crushing victory at Crecy, Edward III held all the leverage. Yet when Clement summoned both sides to negotiate, his proposed truce demanded England surrender hard-won territories while France gave up little. The reason? Avignon, where the papacy resided, was effectively a French client state surrounded by provincial lands loyal to the Valois crown. Diplomacy here wasn't just spiritual, it was survival. But to dismiss the papacy as a mere French puppet misses the bigger picture. Without papal intervention, the war might have descended into total annihilation. Benedict XIII, for instance, spent years shuttling between courts in the early 15th century, not to tilt the scales but to prevent outright collapse. His envoys arranged prisoner exchanges, negotiated local truces, and even convinced rival armies to spare civilian populations during sieges. These weren't empty gestures, they kept entire regions from sliding into famine when war disrupted harvests. The greatest test came with the Congress of Arras in 1435. England, Burgundy, and France sat at the same table under papal legates' watchful eyes. For weeks, Cardinal Albergotti played mediator, dangling compromises that might have ended the war decades early. Burgundy nearly reconciled with France. England's demands were whittled down to manageable terms. But in the end, old grudges ran too deep. Even so, the attempt mattered. It proved that amidst the butchery, someone was still trying to steer Europe back from the brink. What lingers is the irony. The same popes who quietly favored France also restrained her. Every truce they brokered, however uneven, gave shattered communities a breath between storms. Their partiality may have prolonged the conflict, but their presence ensured it never burned completely out of control. In a war where alliances were forged and broken with the seasons, the papacy's greatest role wasn't as a player, but as the fragile thread keeping the tapestry from unraveling entirely. The Hanseatic League didn't deal in crowns or castles, they traded in timber, wool, and Baltic grain, the lifeblood of medieval Europe. And when the 100 Years' War erupted, this sprawling network of merchant cities faced a choice: side with France, the traditional power, or gamble on England, the upstart with deep pockets and a hunger for allies. For the Hansa, as they were known, the decision was never about loyalty, it was about ledger books. England controlled the finest wool in Europe, the golden fleece that fueled Flanders' looms and lined Hanseatic coffers. France, meanwhile, offered little but tariffs and trade restrictions. So when Edward III came calling with promises of tax exemptions and prime port access, the Hansa didn't just nod, they opened their vaults. This wasn't just a business arrangement, it was a lifeline. English ships, vulnerable to French privateers in the Channel, suddenly had Hanseatic cogs, sturdy, broad-beamed vessels crewed by men who knew every current from Lubeck to London, riding escort. When French blockades threatened to starve English garrisons in Calais, it was Hanseatic merchants who smuggled in grain through backdoor routes. Even the timber for England's warships often came from Hanseatic-controlled forests in Prussia, where towering oaks were felled, shaped, and shipped west with ruthless efficiency. The League's greatest gift, though, was invisible: credit. War is expensive, and England's kings were perpetually short of silver. The Hansa solved that problem by advancing vast sums against future wool shipments, effectively turning fleeces into currency. Their banking houses in London and Bruges became the financial engine of England's campaigns, with loans so large they could ransom kings. And when debts came due, the Hansa collected not just in coin, but in privileges, monopolies on English tin, exemptions from tolls, even the right to judge their own merchants in English courts. But the alliance had a razor's edge. The Hansa's neutrality was a carefully crafted illusion. While their ships flew England's flag in the Channel, their diplomats whispered assurances to French envoys in Baltic ports. When the tide of war shifted, so did their generosity. Loans dried up, escorts vanished, and suddenly England found itself scrambling to replace what it had taken for granted. The lesson: in a war fought with swords and siege engines, the quiet power of trade could be just as decisive. The Hansa never raised a sword for England, but their coins and cargoes kept armies fed, fleets afloat, and kings solvent long enough to fight another day. And when the war finally ended, it wasn't just battlefields that decided the outcome. It was the relentless, calculating arithmetic of merchants who knew the price of everything, including loyalty. Portugal's alliance with England wasn't just a political maneuver, it was sealed with a wedding ring. In 1387, King John I of Portugal, fresh from securing his throne against Castilian invaders, made a daring bet. He offered his daughter Philippa's hand in marriage to England's John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster and father of the future Henry IV. This wasn't just a royal match, it was a military pact disguised as a love story. The Portuguese needed allies to fend off Castile's relentless pressure, and England, locked in its own struggle with France, craved a foothold on the Iberian Peninsula. What began as a marriage treaty blossomed into one of the longest-lasting alliances in European history. The Portuguese brought more than just goodwill to the partnership. They brought hardened troops seasoned by decades of border wars with Castile. When English armies landed in Galicia in 1386, aiming to press John of Gaunt's shaky claim to the Castilian throne, Portuguese knights formed the backbone of their campaign. These weren't just auxiliaries, they were specialists in the brutal frontier warfare that defined Iberian conflicts. Their knowledge of the terrain and tactics gave the English a fighting chance in a land where they were hopelessly out of their depth. Though the campaign ultimately failed, the bonds forged in those muddy trenches endured. But the real test came decades later at the Battle of El Jubarrota in 1385. Facing a massive Castilian invasion, Portugal's King John turned to his English allies for help. A small but lethal contingent of English Longbowmen answered the call, their arrows cutting down Castilian knights in a slaughter so decisive it became Portugal's national legend. The victory didn't just save Portugal's independence, it proved the alliance's worth. From that moment on, Portuguese ships guarded England's flanks against Castilian raids, while English garrisons stood watch over Portuguese trade routes. What made this partnership unique wasn't just its longevity, but its reciprocity. While most alliances in the 100 Years' War were transactional mercenaries for gold, nobles for land, Portugal and England treated each other as equals. Portuguese navigators shared their cutting-edge cartography with English explorers, laying the groundwork for the Age of Discovery. English wool merchants secured preferential dockside access in Lisbon, bypassing French-controlled Flanders altogether. Even their rivalry with Castile became a shared project, with joint naval patrols harassing Castilian shipping from the Bay of Biscay to the Strait of Gibraltar. The irony: this alliance outlasted the war itself. Long after the last English soldier left French soil, Portuguese and English forces continued fighting side by side, against the Ottomans in North Africa, against the Spanish Armada, even in the trenches of World War I. That 1387 marriage treaty didn't just create allies, it built a family, and in the brutal arithmetic of medieval power, blood proved thicker than borders. The Bohemian mercenaries didn't just fight in the 100 Years' War, they rewrote the rules of engagement. These were the hardened veterans of the Hussite Wars, men who had spent years perfecting the art of asymmetrical warfare against the might of the Holy Roman Empire. When religious persecution drove them from their homeland, they brought their brutal expertise to France and England, selling their skills to the highest bidder. But hiring these fighters was a double-edged sword. They won battles, but their scorched earth tactics left entire regions smoldering in their wake. What made the Hussites so terrifying wasn't just their skill with the war wagon, those mobile fortresses bristling with crossbows and early handguns. It was their philosophy of total war. They didn't just defeat armies, they eradicated supply lines, poisoned wells, and burned crops to starve enemies into submission. A French chronicler described their approach as war without chivalry, where ambushes replaced pitched battles and terror became a weapon. When the English hired a contingent of Bohemians to garrison Normandy, the local population soon begged for their removal. The mercenaries had stripped the countryside bare, leaving even their employers scrambling to feed their own troops. Yet both sides kept coming back to them, and for good reason. At the Siege of Orleans in 1428, a band of Bohemian sappers tunneled beneath French walls, collapsing entire sections of the fortifications with carefully placed explosives. In Gascony, their raiding parties moved like ghosts, vanishing into forests after ambushing supply convoys. The French, initially hesitant to employ heretics, quickly changed their tune after witnessing their effectiveness. King Charles VII even quietly recruited Hussite commanders to train his own forces in their unconventional tactics, hoping to replicate their success without the collateral damage. The irony was thick enough to choke on. These men, exiled for rebelling against established authority, became the ultimate enforcers for kings and dukes. Their religious zeal, once directed against the Catholic Church, now served whichever monarch paid their fees, and pay they did. The Bohemians demanded premium wages, knowing their reputation alone could demoralize enemy troops before the first arrow flew. But the legacy of these mercenaries wasn't just in the battles they won. It was in the lessons they taught Europe about the cost of total war. Long after the last Hussite left French soil, their tactics lingered, in the way armies began prioritizing supply lines, in the rise of mobile artillery, even in the grudging respect for irregular warfare. They proved that sometimes the most dangerous ally isn't the one who fights beside you, but the one who shows you just how far war can go when all the old rules are burned away. The Count of Foix wasn't just a noble, he was a tightrope walker, balancing precariously between two warring giants while his Pyrenean domains hung in the balance. Officially, Gaston Phobos, as he was known, swore fealty to the French crown, attending royal councils and mouthing the right platitudes. But behind closed doors, his messengers slipped through mountain passes to English garrisons, carrying promises of safe passage and covert supplies. This wasn't treason to him, it was survival. Nestled between France's grasping monarchy and England's expanding Gascon holdings, Foix's independence depended on playing both sides against each other with the precision of a master diplomat. What made his double game so audacious was the sheer scale of his deception. While French tax collectors counted his vineyards and castles as part of the kingdom, English commanders knew his mountain fortresses as way stations for their troops moving between Bordeaux and Navarre. His knights, clad in unmarked armor, would ambush French patrols one week, then vanish before English forces could thank them. Even his court became a theater of shadows. French envoys dined in his great hall, while English agents whispered with his stewards in the cellar below. The genius of his strategy lay in timing. When France seemed ascendant, Gaston would lead token contingents to join their armies, always arriving late, leaving early, and avoiding decisive battles. When English victories piled up, his markets mysteriously overflowed with grain for their troops. He even turned his lands into a sanctuary for both sides' deserters, recruiting the toughest into his personal guard while selling the rest back to their former masters for ransom. It was a racket disguised as statecraft, and for decades it worked brilliantly, but the cracks began to show when his own family turned against him. His son, resentful of being excluded from the schemes, leaked letters to French spies detailing his father's dealings with England. The revelation sparked a firestorm. French troops massed on his borders, while English captains, fearing he'd betray them next, cut off their covert support. Cornered, Gaston made his final play. He invited the French king's investigators to his court, then produced meticulously forged documents, proving his loyalty. The gamble bought him a few more years, but the illusion was shattered. In the end, his legacy wasn't victory or defeat. It was a masterclass in the art of the possible. The Count of Foix proved that in the 100 Years' War, small powers could outmaneuver great ones, not with armies but with guile. And though his dance between giants couldn't last forever, the sheer audacity of his performance left even his enemies grudgingly impressed. The Lombard bankers didn't fight with swords, they fought with ledgers. While knights clashed on battlefields, these Italian financiers waged their own war from counting houses in Florence, Genoa, and Milan, where fortunes were won and lost with the stroke of a pen. Their weapon, cold, hard cash. The 100 Years' War was the most expensive conflict Europe had ever seen, and without the Lombards' gold, neither England nor France could have kept their armies fed, armed, or marching. But this wasn't charity. It was high-stakes gambling, where the odds were terrible and the house always won. Until it didn't. Picture Edward III of England in 1337, staring down a problem every modern college graduate would recognize: crushing debt. His grandfather had already emptied the treasury, and now France's Philip VI was daring him to back up his claim to the throne with actual troops. Enter the Bardi and Peruzzi families, Florence's banking dynasties, who fronted Edward the equivalent of millions in today's money. Their terms are outrageous interest rates, repayment in wool exports, England's only real commodity, and liens on entire counties. It was the medieval version of a payday loan, and for a while it worked. The Bardi's gold bankrolled the English invasion fleet that triggered the war, funded the Longbowmen who won at Crecy, and kept Edward's mercenaries from mutinying when pay was late. But the French crown was playing the same game. Philip turned to the Spinola family of Genoa, who underwrote his army's payroll in exchange for trading monopolies from Marseille to Bruges. The Lombards became the invisible puppet masters of the war. Florentine bankers whispering in Edward's ear one day, Genoese moneylenders haggling with Philip's treasurers the next. Their networks stretched across Europe, moving money faster than any army could march. A letter of credit written in Paris could be cashed in Naples within weeks, allowing kings to hire German knights, Bohemian crossbowmen, and Scottish pikemen without ever shipping chests of silver across bandit-infested roads. The system worked beautifully until it collapsed. In 1345, Edward III did the unthinkable. He defaulted. The Bardi and Peruzzi, who'd lent him sums equal to half of England's annual GDP, were wiped out overnight. Florence's economy imploded as bankruptcies rippled through the city. The Peruzzi family, once so wealthy they'd financed popes, vanished into poverty. The Bardi clung on by selling their palazzos and art collections, but their power was broken. Meanwhile in France, Philip's successors played a crueler game. They repaid their Genoese creditors. with freshly debased coinage, effectively cheating them without technically defaulting. Yet the Lombards didn't retreat, they adapted. New banking houses like the Medici learned from their predecessors' mistakes, insisting on collateral they could seize, like the crown jewels of England, which spent decades locked in a Genoese vault as loan security. They diversified their portfolios, lending smaller sums to more clients so no single king's betrayal could ruin them. And most brilliantly, they turned themselves into political players, with Medici agents becoming papal financiers and royal advisors, weaving their interests so deeply into power structures that defaulting on them meant destabilizing entire kingdoms. The lesson was clear. In the 100 Years' War, money wasn't just fuel for the conflict, it was the conflict. The Lombards proved that finance could shape destinies as decisively as any battlefield, but they also learned the hardest truth of all. When the drums of war sound, even the richest bankers are just one royal signature away from ruin. The Irish Clansmen who fought in the 100 Years' War didn't march under banners of kings or nations. They came for the one currency that mattered in the rugged hills of Ireland: opportunity. These were men raised on tribal warfare, where cattle raids and border skirmishes were a way of life. When English recruiters landed on their shores with promises of silver and land grants, they weren't just hiring soldiers, they were tapping into a centuries-old tradition of martial exile. In Gaelic culture, young warriors often left home to sell their swords abroad, proving their worth before returning as legends. For England, this meant gaining fighters whose tactics were as unpredictable as the weather on the Irish Sea. What made these mercenaries so valuable wasn't just their skill with the fearsome galloglass axe, a weapon so heavy it could cleave through armor, but their mastery of guerrilla warfare. While English armies relied on disciplined formations and longbow volleys, the Irish fought in loose, mobile bands, using terrain to their advantage. They'd ambush French supplied trains from dense forests, vanish into marshlands when pursued, and strike at night with a ferocity that left garrisons sleepless. At the Siege of Rouen in 1418, chroniclers described how Irish auxiliaries scaled walls using ropes and grappling hooks, slipping past defenses that had held against conventional assaults for months. Yet their presence was a double-edged sword. The same tactics that made them effective also made them difficult to control. Irish war bands, accustomed to operating independently, often ignored English commanders' orders, pursuing their own agendas of plunder. There are accounts of them abandoning sieges to raid nearby villages or refusing to fight unless given additional pay upfront. This wasn't insubordination, it was the mercenaries' creed, deeply ingrained in their warrior culture. The irony, many of these Irish fighters came from clans that had spent generations resisting English rule at home. Men whose fathers had fought against Norman invaders now wore the English king's livery in France, a testament to the war's strange power to reshape loyalties. Some even found themselves facing fellow Gaels, Scottish mercenaries, fighting for France in battles where Celtic war cries echoed on both sides of the field. Their legacy is a footnote in most histories of the war, but it's a revealing one. The Irish mercenaries proved that conflict on this scale didn't just draw in nations, it pulled in entire cultures, turning ancient rivalries into chess pieces in a much larger game. And for the clansmen who survived, the rewards were more than just gold. Many settled in Normandy and Gascony, their descendants becoming part of the fabric of French towns, a living reminder that war's reach extends far beyond the battlefield. The fields of France weren't just battlegrounds for knights and kings, they were the shattered homes of peasants caught in a war they never asked for. For decades, these villagers endured the unspeakable. Crops burned by English raiders, taxes doubled by French lords desperate to fund their armies, and the constant terror of mercenary bands descending like locusts to strip them bare. But by the 1400s, something snapped. The Jacquerie, the name given to the peasant uprisings, wasn't just a revolt against hunger. It was a raw scream of survival, a moment when the forgotten decided they'd rather die fighting than starve kneeling. What made these revolts so extraordinary wasn't their violence, though that was gruesome enough, but their sheer strategic desperation. In regions like Normandy, entire villages began negotiating directly with English garrisons, offering food and labor in exchange for protection from French tax collectors and roaming bandits. Imagine the surreal scene, a group of dirt-poor farmers still reeking of the fields, standing before an English captain to barter their loyalty for a promise of safety. These weren't formal treaties, they were handshake deals between the powerless and the pragmatic, temporary truces carved out of mutual exhaustion. The French crown saw these arrangements as treason, of course. But for the peasants, it was simple math. When the Duke of Burgundy's men burned your barns and the king's officials demanded grain you didn't have, the English, for all their faults, at least offered a predictable set of demands. Pay their garrisons in wheat, and they'd leave your daughters unmolested. Hand over a portion of your harvest, and their archers might even drive off those mercenaries lurking in the woods. It was a devil's bargain, but one that kept children alive through winter. Some of these alliances took on bizarrely formal shapes. In the Loire Valley, English commanders appointed peasant leaders as local enforcers, tasking them with collecting taxes from their own neighbors, a grim twist where the oppressed became middlemen. Near Calais, villagers flew makeshift flags stitched from English banners and French rags, signaling to passing war bands that they'd paid their dues to both sides and wanted only to be left alone. For a time it worked, until inevitably the war's tide would shift and new armies would arrive demanding new loyalties or burning the old ones along with the haystacks. The cruelest irony, these peasant truces often collapsed not from betrayal but from success. When a village thrived under English protection, French raiders saw it as a target worth destroying. When a harvest was good, both sides demanded larger shares until nothing remained. And always, always, the war ground on, chewing up the very people who fed it. The Jacquerie's rebellions flickered out not with conquest or pardon, but with the quiet erasure of entire communities, their names surviving only in the ledgers of lords tallying lost revenues. Yet in their brief, defiant existence, these peasant alliances revealed a truth the chroniclers often missed. The 100 Years' War wasn't just decided on battlefields or in royal courts. It was fought in the dirt by people who understood the real stakes better than any king. That survival, not victory, was the only cause worth bleeding for. The English Church didn't just bless the 100 Years' War, it bankrolled it. While monks prayed in their cloisters and bishops preached from their pulpits, a quieter, more pragmatic machinery was turning behind the scenes. This wasn't just about faith, it was about finance. When Edward III needed gold to launch his campaigns, he didn't just tax his nobles, he leaned on the wealthiest institution in the realm, the church. And the bishops, many of them seasoned politicians in clerical robes, didn't just open their coffers, they rewrote the narrative, transforming a dynastic squabble into a sacred crusade. Take Archbishop John Stratford of Canterbury. In 1337, as Edward prepared his claim to the French throne, Stratford didn't just offer prayers, he brokered loans. Monasteries across England were quietly persuaded to contribute a year's income to the war chest, their manuscripts noting the gifts as voluntary, though the king's enforcers loomed in the background. But the real power lay in the pulpit. Church sermons began painting the French as godless usurpers, their Valois kings tyrants who oppressed true Christians. By the time Edward's fleet sailed, even peasants in far-flung villages believed defeating France was God's own work. The Church's propaganda machine was relentless. Miracle stories circulated of saints appearing to English soldiers mid-battle, of French arrows miraculously turning aside at Agincourt. When Henry V invaded Normandy in 1415, his chaplains didn't just carry crosses, they carried carefully crafted manifestos declaring his right to rule as divinely ordained. French counterclaims were dismissed as heresy, their priests branded as corrupt. The message was clear: supporting the war wasn't just patriotic, it was pious. Yet this alliance had its tensions. Many lower clergy, particularly Franciscan friars, openly questioned the war's morality, their sermons warning against the greed of kings. The Church's vast landholdings in France also created awkward loyalties, bishops collecting rents from French peasants while funding armies to burn their homes. When the tide of war turned, some clerics even switched sides, like Bishop Beaufort of Winchester, who later funneled church funds to peace negotiations. The legacy of this partnership lingers in the stained glass of English cathedrals, where battle scenes sit alongside saints. It proved that in medieval Europe, faith and power weren't just allies, they were two sides of the same coin. And when the Church spoke, millions listened not just to sermons but to the unspoken promise that victory on the battlefield might just buy salvation in the next life. The Castilian navy didn't just change sides, it rewrote the rules of naval warfare in the 100 Years' War. For decades, France had relied on Castile ships to patrol the English Channel, their sleek galleries cutting through the waves like blades. But in 1372, everything flipped. Enrique of Trastamara, the ruthless Castilian king who'd once been France's golden ally, suddenly threw his fleet behind England. This wasn't just a shift in loyalty, it was a death sentence for French maritime power. Overnight, the Channel became a killing zone. Castilian captains, who knew every cove and current from years of hunting pirates, now turned their expertise against their former friends. Their galleys, faster and more maneuverable than France's bulky cogs, swarmed French merchant convoys, sinking ships laden with grain, weapons, and most crucially, salt. Without that precious cargo, French garrisons couldn't preserve meat for winter, and armies began starving long before they saw an English arrow. The blockade was so effective that Bordeaux, England's stronghold in Gascony, saw wine prices plummet as merchants desperate to offload cargo flooded the market, while Parisians paid 10 times the usual rate for a loaf of bread. But the real terror came from the Castilian tactics. These weren't the chivalric skirmishes of knights on horseback. Castilian sailors fought like wolves, boarding enemy ships with grappling hooks and iron-tipped boarding pikes, slaughtering crews before tossing their bodies overboard as warnings. At the Battle of La Rochelle, they didn't just defeat the French fleet, they annihilated it, capturing admirals in their nightclothes as they tried to flee burning ships. The victory was so complete that for years afterward, French fishermen refused to sail beyond sight of shore, terrified of the crimson sails on the horizon. What made this alliance so devastating was its timing. France, already reeling from the Black Death and peasant revolts, couldn't rebuild its navy fast enough. Castilian ships prowled the coast unchecked, sinking reinforcements bound for Calais, intercepting messengers, even burning entire port towns to deny their use as staging grounds. The economic strangulation was slow but inexorable. By the 1380s, records show French coastal churches melting down their silver chalices to pay ransoms for captured merchants, a humiliating admission that the sea, once a French lifeline, now belonged to their enemies. Yet the cruelest twist lay in the politics. Enrique hadn't switched sides for ideology or even gold, he'd done it for revenge. Years earlier, France had backed his rival in Castile's civil war, and now he returned the favor by gutting their maritime strength. The lesson was clear. In the 100 Years' War, even the most steadfast alliances were just temporary ceasefires in a longer game of vengeance. And for France, the cost of that lesson was measured in empty harbors, silent markets, and the slow, suffocating grip of a blockade that no army could break. High in the Alpine passes, where the air thins and the rocks grow jagged, the Savoyard knights carved their legend into the history of the 100 Years' War. These weren't just any warriors, they were specialists in the brutal art of mountain warfare, bred in the thin air of the Alps, where every step could be a battle against the terrain itself. When they rode into battle for France, they brought something most armies lacked: the ability to turn geography into a weapon. Their moment of greatest impact came at the Battle of Anthon in 1430. Outnumbered and outflanked, the French forces were on the verge of collapse when the Savoyards arrived, not with the thunder of a full cavalry charge, but with the precision of a dagger strike. Instead of clashing head-on with the enemy's front lines, they scaled the steep wooded slopes unseen, emerging behind the Anglo-Burgundian positions like ghosts materializing from the mist. The shock of their sudden attack, combined with the terrifying efficiency of their close-quarters combat, shattered the enemy's cohesion. Chroniclers described how the Savoyards fought with hooked polearms designed to drag riders from their saddles, a tactic so unnerving that entire formations broke and fled rather than face them. What made these knights so formidable wasn't just their skill, it was their adaptability. Unlike the French heavy cavalry, who relied on open fields to unleash their charges, the Savoyards thrived in chaos. At the Siege of Orleans, they led nighttime sorties through collapsed sections of the city walls, their knowledge of uneven terrain letting them move silently where armored knights would have stumbled. During the Loire campaign, their scouts found hidden fords that allowed French reinforcements to bypass English strongholds entirely. Time and again, they proved that in war, the right handful of experts could outweigh entire companies of common soldiers. Yet their allegiance was never guaranteed. The Counts of Savoy played both sides for decades, and the knights themselves were mercenaries in all but name, loyal only as long as the pay and prestige held out. When the Duke of Burgundy offered double wages in 1434, whole contingents nearly defected before the French crown matched the offer. That tension between their battlefield indispensability and their political flexibility summed up the war itself. Victory often hinged less on national loyalty than on who could secure the sharpest blades at the right moment. The Savoyards' final legacy wasn't in the battles they won, but in the lesson they taught. Wars aren't decided by numbers alone. Sometimes it's the specialists, the ones who know how to turn a cliff face into a road or a forest into an ambush, who tilt the scales when it matters most. And in the 100 Years' War, where every advantage was fleeting, that lesson was worth its weight in gold. The Swiss weren't supposed to be here. Officially neutral in the 100 Years' War, these mountain warriors had no dog in the fight between England and France. Yet by the 1400s, a curious sight began appearing on battlefields across Europe. Blocks of Swiss pikemen, their 18-foot spears bristling like a steel forest, marching under the banners of whoever could meet their price. This wasn't just another mercenary band. It was a glimpse into warfare's future, where disciplined infantry would shatter the age of chivalry. What made the Swiss so formidable wasn't brute strength, though they had that in spades, but their eerie synchronization. Where knights relied on individual valor, the Swiss moved as a single organism. Their pike squares advanced at a steady, relentless pace, drums setting the rhythm, each man's weapon overlapping his neighbor's to create an impenetrable wall of sharpened steel. At the Battle of St. Jacob in 1444, A force of just 1,500 Swiss held off nearly 30,000 French troops for hours, their formations turning the battlefield into a slaughterhouse for cavalry charges. The message was clear: the days when a nobleman's armor and bloodline guaranteed victory were ending. France, desperate for any edge against England's Longbowmen, became their most eager employer. King Charles VII didn't just hire Swiss companies, he reverse-engineered their tactics, training French infantry to mimic their cohesion. The resulting units, called Franks archers, were a pale imitation, but they marked a seismic shift in military thinking. Suddenly, the peasant with a pike could topple the knight on his warhorse, and European armies would never be the same. Yet the Swiss themselves remained mercenaries to the core. They fought for gold, not glory, and their loyalty lasted exactly as long as the contract specified. There are accounts of Swiss captains coolly informing employers that their time was up mid-campaign, packing their kits and marching home while battles raged around them. This wasn't betrayal, it was business, and in a war where kings broke treaties before the ink dried, their blunt honesty was almost refreshing. Their true legacy, though, wasn't in the battles they won, but in the fear they inspired. Long after the 100 Years' War ended, the mere rumor of approaching Swiss columns could make armies fold without a fight. They proved that warfare's next evolution wouldn't come from brighter armor or heavier swords, but from the unbreakable will of men who knew their worth and fought not for crowns, but for the weight of silver in their pockets. Beneath the clang of swords and the roar of sieges, another war was being waged, one fought in shadows and whispers. While kings and generals plotted their grand strategies, a hidden network of spies moved like ghosts between Paris and London, their stolen secrets shaping the fate of battles before the first arrow was nocked. Among them, the Scots were the unsung masters of this silent game. Their agents, often posing as merchants or clergy, slipped through the gates of Paris with uncanny ease, their accents blending into the city's cosmopolitan hum. One such operative, a Gaelic-speaking friar named Brother Ewan, became legendary in French intelligence circles for his ability to extract troop movements from drunken English officers in taverns near Calais. His reports, smuggled back in hollowed-out prayer books, allowed French commanders to ambush supply convoys with chilling precision. But the French weren't just passive recipients of Scottish cunning, they returned the favor with operatives of their own. In London, a linen merchant known as Jacques de Montreuil, likely a pseudonym, ran a bustling shop near the docks where his gossipy charm masked a razor-sharp mind. He memorized ship manifests and troop rotations, encoding them in innocuous-looking fabric orders sent to collaborators in Edinburgh. One intercepted letter, hidden in the hem of a bolt of Flemish wool, revealed England's plans to reinforce Bordeaux in 1420, intelligence that let the French Navy sink half the transport fleet before it reached Gascony. The real brilliance of this spy network lay in its asymmetry. While English counterintelligence focused on rooting out French moles, they often overlooked the Scots, dismissing them as marginal players. That blind spot proved fatal. Scottish spies leveraged their Auld Alliance with France not just for battlefield advantage, but for personal vendettas. Clan leaders with grudges against English-backed rivals would feed French agents details about weak points in northern garrisons, knowing Paris would happily strike where it hurt England most. Yet the most devastating espionage coup had nothing to do with battle plans. In 1405, a French spy embedded in the English court, a lowly scribe with access to royal correspondence, intercepted a letter detailing Henry IV's secret negotiations with Burgundy. The leak shattered Burgundy's trust in England, delaying their alliance long enough for French forces to regroup. It was a reminder that in this war, the most powerful weapons weren't always swords or cannons, but the right whisper in the right ear at the right time. What these shadow operatives understood, and what their kings often forgot, was that loyalty in espionage was as fluid as the tides. A Scottish agent might swear allegiance to France today, only to sell French secrets to the highest bidder tomorrow. The real currency of this hidden war wasn't patriotism, but opportunity. And in the end, the silent victories of these unsung spies may have done more to shape the 100 Years' War than 1,000 charging knights. From backroom deals to battlefield betrayals, these 25 alliances reveal a truth often lost in the grand narratives of kings and conquests. The 100 Years' War wasn't just won on the muddy fields of Agincourt or the blood-stained walls of Orleans. It was decided in candlelit chambers where enemies clasped hands over shared greed, in mountain passes where mercenaries sold their loyalty with a shrug, and in the quiet moments when a desperate ruler realized survival meant swallowing pride. Every improbable partnership, Burgundy's vengeful pact with England, the Gascon lords trading fealty for autonomy, even the Lombard bankers betting kingdoms like dice, proved that in war the most powerful weapon wasn't always a sword. Sometimes it was a well-timed handshake. Take the long view, and you'll see these alliances weren't just tactical stops on the road to victory. They were seismic shifts in how power worked. When Welsh archers fought alongside the English crown that had once crushed their homeland, or when Swiss pikemen showed Europe that peasant infantry could topple armored knights, they weren't just changing battles, they were rewriting the rules of the game. The war's legacy isn't just in territory gained or lost, but in the uncomfortable truth it laid bare. Loyalty was always negotiable. A king's claim to divine right meant little when a banker's ledger said otherwise, and the fiercest knight's oath could crumble before the weight of a well-filled purse. Yet for all their pragmatism, these alliances left scars that outlasted the war itself. The Burgundian betrayal didn't just weaken France, it planted the seeds of a rivalry that would explode into civil war. Portugal's marriage treaty with England birthed a bond that still echoes in NATO councils today. Even the free companies, those rootless sellswords, taught Europe a brutal lesson. If you couldn't control the men who fought for gold, you couldn't control the war. So what's the real takeaway? History loves to paint wars as clashes of heroes and villains, but the 100 Years' War reminds us that the lines were always blurrier. The enemy might be tomorrow's ally, yesterday's friend might be tonight's assassin, and the quietest deal, struck over wine in some forgotten castle, could matter more than 1,000 charging horses. It's a lesson that echoes far beyond the Middle Ages, in every conflict where survival trumps ideology. If these stories of shifting loyalties and razor-thin margins captivated you, there's more where that came from. From the Mongols' surprise pacts to the Cold War's strangest bedfellows, history is full of alliances that defied the odds and changed the world. Hit that like button if you want more deep dives into the deals and betrayals that shaped our past, and subscribe so you never miss a tale of strategy, survival, and the art of the impossible team-up. After all, as the 100 Years' War taught us, you never know who you'll need on your side when the stakes get high.